Welcome to another episode of Facts. I'm your host, Stephen Boyce. We're doing an episode today on the structure of the church. When Jesus Christ left this world and gave us instruction, the Great Commission, Matthew 28, Acts chapter number 1, what was it that he had in mind when he sent the churches out? Obviously, he sent them to go into all the world, preach the gospel. I don't think anybody's disputing that. The question is that an orderless situation where there's no structure, there's no anticipation of problems that need to be dealt with? Did Jesus institute an idea, a process, people, authorities in place in order to govern, direct, lead, guide, challenge, change the church? Did he not use his apostles to institute a situation where the church would be functionally moving forward with its leaders in place? The answer is yes to all of that. Yes, across the board. And the reality is this, is that we see early evidence of this in the New Testament, specifically in Acts. We see it also earlier in Jesus' instructions. One of the things that I've pointed out recently in my study of Matthew has actually been one of the famous topics of debate over the last couple of months amongst just different apologists or skeptics or YouTubers, podcasters have been talking about Matthew a lot. One of the things that I've continually contended for, and just did so recently in the debate where Wes Huff and I debated Aaron Abke and Cam Waters, is that in the Gospel of Matthew, I was given just a short period of time to share my perspective of how Matthew came into existence. One of the things that I pointed out is that I believe it was a group gospel from the headquarters of Jerusalem. And one of the things that we find about Matthew versus Mark, for example, is that we believe Mark's gospel is Peter's sermons collected by John Mark. But in Peter's sermons, there's a lot of Peter involved, but not a lot of Petrine authority being exercised. In fact, one of the things that we find in it is that there's a ton of mistakes by Peter, right pronunciations, right statements at times, being in the right place at the right time, but also being in the wrong place and being around the wrong kind of people and getting his foot stuck in his mouth and arguing with Jesus. I mean, we see all that in Mark as well. But one of the things that shows in Matthew's gospel, even though the quality of the gospel is geared toward Jewish believers and how people are coming to Jesus and how they can know he is the King of the Jews, he is the son of David, he is the descendant of Abraham. That's how the gospel starts. Even though that's the mainline perspective of Matthew's focus, he also does something that is different from Mark that I think Luke also picks up on as well, particularly in Acts more than Luke. And that is they focus on the authority given to Peter. We find this in a couple places. The major one, I did a podcast on just a few weeks ago on Matthew chapter number 16. You are Peter. On this rock, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And then he tells him he's given him the keys of binding and loosening on the earth. We know he gave that to all the apostles, but particularly Matthew wanted to focus on a single figure in the group. Matthew also demonstrates quite a bit of the three that are amongst the 12 that are with Jesus frequently. That's Peter, James, and John. But Peter himself is designated at places in Matthew's gospel where it appears he has authority that he is issuing out or being given authority by Jesus himself, not just over the church itself, but particularly even as a leader amongst the apostles. Luke definitely piggybacks on this. Definitely. We find in Acts chapter number 1, after Jesus has ascended, one of the apostolic leaders, or the word used here is bishopric, one of the apostles that was obviously a traitor, manipulative, a thief, John tells us, being Judas Iscariot, he needs to be replaced because Jesus explicitly chose 12 to be the very voice of his teachings to send the message of the gospel into the world. So all of the apostles represent the see, not EASEE, these different sees, these locational headquarters that are going to bring the gospel into regions of the world. And we've done an entire series in the past on the different apostles. We talked about Thomas going to India. We talked about Peter and Paul in Rome. We talked about John and Andrew in the East. We went through all of these. We looked at all 12 of the apostles. But as the message was going to disperse, the connectivity that Jesus prayed for his apostles, that they would be one as he and the Father are one, had to be sustained through some sort of organizational ideas. Did Jesus just give us an idea, or did he give us practical and tangible steps to make those realities? And we see in the very beginning, after Jesus has ascended, a major decision must be made for the bishopric of the see of the apostles. One of the sees is lacking because Judas is a traitor and he went out and hung himself. So we find ourselves in Acts chapter number 1, and Luke wants us to see who is involved in the scenario. Number 1, we see all the apostles listed specifically by name in this passage. But it is Peter who stands up. It is Peter who actually starts leading this conversation. Now note the words here, and I'll read it to you for those. I'm in Acts chapter number 1, verse 15. Now, at that time, Peter stood up among the brothers and sisters, a group of about 120 people was there together. Now, we don't know all of the people that were there. We could make quite an assumption. Naturally, the 12 were there. We could even argue that a lot of the women that were at the tomb, we looked at Mary Magdalene, whether you're looking at Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary, my goodness, just put a Mary in there. There's probably about 5 or 6 because we've seen in the Gospels different Marys. We've probably seen other people like the 2 disciples on the road of Emmaus. They're probably amongst this group. There's a lot of assumption who the other 100 or so are outside of the basic names that have already been given to us in Luke and Matthew and Mark. But one person amongst this small community of Jesus followers rises up and begins to speak in a manner that shows somebody is actually leading this group. Brothers, and it says, brothers, the scripture has been fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit foretold by the mouth of David concerning Judas, who became a guide to those who arrested Jesus. For he was counted among us and received his share in this ministry. He goes on. Now, again, that's the bishopric. That's the leadership. That's what he was talking about, that they should take the gospel out. He had already proclaimed that in Luke's perspective here, where he says that Jesus said that you would receive power and then the Holy Spirit would come upon them and they would be witnesses to him in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth. You see that in verse 8 and 9. Now, one of the things that ends up happening here is Peter continues to speak. He said, for he was counted among us and received his share of the ministry. Now this man, and then he talks about what happened to Judas. He acquired a field and pretty much said that his insides gushed out. And then they named the place the field of blood. He says, therefore it is necessary, because he says somebody needs to take another office. And he's quoting the Old Testament here. And he says it's necessary that somebody replace this office, this bishopric, if you would. Of all the men who have accompanied us among this time, the Lord Jesus went in among us, beginning with the baptism of John. Up to this day, he was taken from us. One of them must become a witness of his resurrection, which everybody seems to be a witness here of the resurrected Jesus at this point. And the men that are in this room, there are qualified men who are not just at the resurrection, but all the way back to John the Baptist. So they ended up casting lots between Justus and Matthias. We know that the lot landed at the feet of Matthias. Now, why is that significant? Because Matthias becomes an instrumental apostle. Now, we talked about his martyrdom. We talked about his investigation as an apostle. Did he actually deserve to be one? Sure, he did, because he became the bishopric as we look at his see and what he did bringing the gospel into the world. But why is it that Peter seems to be in charge of making sure all the sees, if you would, or the ministries or the headquarters of the gospel that was prophetically told by Jesus to go to, and that he would be with them in doing that? Why is it that Peter feels like he has the responsibility to rise amongst his brothers and make directional changes under his advice that affect not just him, but the entirety of the group, the whole entirety of ministry and bishopric? He is apparently a leader amongst the others. And Luke wants us to see that. Luke wants us to acknowledge that. Even the New Testament wants us to acknowledge that. And then obviously the lot fell at Matthias. He becomes the replacement of Judas. And now the gospel ministry can continue in the manner in which Jesus desired it. Now I want to build on this a little bit more. I want to actually take this to a letter. There was a lot of correspondence, thankfully, that was preserved from Pope Leo the Great. Now, there was not just his letters, but those that wrote to him. One of the things that I want to point out about the letter correspondence is we're going to see a bishop from the Persia region, modern day Iran, who writes a letter to Pope Leo the Great. Now, let's get our timeline here. So, Pope Leo the Great was coming in right after the major decision at the Council of Ephesus dealing with Nestorianism and various views about Jesus' humanity and divinity, just reasserting that after the Council of Nicaea in 325. Now we're in 431, and Leo is on the rise of dealing with continual additional problems of Christology, which leads to the Council of Chalcedon, which you're going to actually start seeing even hints of in these letters. So I challenge anybody, go read. We have multiple letters that have survived antiquity between Leo and others. So there's a lot of writings. Now I want to draw our attention to one of the letters that was given to Leo, not from Leo, but given to Leo from the bishop in Cyrus. And the reason I want to do this is because one of the things that I want to demonstrate for all of us is that when we're dealing with the subject of bishopric, or we're dealing with the subject of the universality of the apostles' churches, was someone ever supposed to be in charge? Was there supposed to be somebody that was seen as the leader? Was there somebody supposed to be taking responsibility of major decisions when all the sees are coming together? Again, we see this in Acts chapter 15 as well, the Council of Jerusalem. We see James the Just who's involved. We see Peter involved. Paul and Barnabas, they give a statement, and Peter acknowledges their statement, and James comes behind everybody and wraps it up, being that he is the leader of Jerusalem. But why is it that Peter got up there and spoke? Why isn't it that Andrew didn't say something? His brother didn't say anything. Why didn't he get in there and get involved? Why isn't it that John, who's a tremendous disciple of Jesus, in fact, he was the one that Jesus loved. I mean, he's the one sitting on Jesus' breast, leaning up on him regularly at the table or sitting around his teaching. Why isn't John up there giving his 10 cents and it's recorded? Luke is consistently showing us that these churches, as the gospel goes, has instrumental apostles for their leaders, especially Paul. He's made a great deal of Paul, but showing that James the Just has been left as the leader of the church of Jerusalem, but that he is not the only voice. He's actually just summarizing for the church of Jerusalem and issuing these documents that go out and tell them what to do and how to handle this situation, with Peter also rising and speaking on behalf of a decision that needed to be made about the circumcision. Peter is an instrumental apostle as it relates to getting out the message of the gospel in a coherent way, where the Apostolic Sees are found in unity around decisions, so that the works and the decisions that are made and done need to go out unified, and the apostles' names are written on it. But specifically, we find Peter is always the one who, from Acts 1 to Acts 15, working these things out and putting sort of a organizational idea to the Apostolic Sees, and everyone seems to follow his leadership advice. That doesn't mean he's perfect. I mean, we see later on he had to be corrected to the face. I mean, we're not sitting here saying that the guy's perfect and did everything right. But what I'm going to do for those, especially watching on YouTube, those that are listening on the podcast, you'll just have to listen very closely. I'm going to pull up one of the letters here. It's a good letter. It's one of those things where when I get into the discussion of Leo or somebody like that, let me pull it back down for a minute as I get in. When we talk about him, we have to understand that he is writing to the different churches about an issue that are in the East. There's a lot of bishops, a lot of leaders, and even the emperor. He's going back and forth because of the issues that are arising, particularly eastward. Everybody's now asking his advice. He's trying to give advice. He's trying to share ideas. Why? That alone ought to tell us, why is everybody corresponding with the Bishop of Rome in order to know what they should do, how they should handle things? I'm going to show you another letter in a little bit, or at least cover it if we don't get to it. But they're dying for his message. I mean, not dying literally, but like they're just dying for information. They want him to have some sort of decision making, some sort of ideas that they can, attach to and live on. I mean, they need him for what they are doing. And I don't want to ignore that. I don't want to ignore that at all. All right, so let's bring this back up on the stage for us. I want to show you what we're dealing with. Here's our reading for today. This is the letter going into Leo, Bishop of Rome. We see it's from Theodoret, Bishop of Cyrus. Now, you can find a lot of this in different volumes, particularly. You can even find this in the Church Father writings. This is particularly taken from different series that have been translated. You can look all of these up for yourself. There's multiple translations of this. This isn't some sort of like secret thing. I mean, they're available for anybody that wants to read it. Now it says, if Paul, the herald of the truth, the trumpet of the Holy Spirit, which, my goodness, like just in those first words, I'm instantly drawn into this letter. When these writers in the 5th century are looking at the Apostle Paul, one of the things that they're already dealing with is the subject of inspiration. They're dealing with how the apostles were perceived a certain way. Paul here is called the herald of truth and the trumpet of the Holy Ghost. I mean, that's quite a flattery statement, but it is. What they recognized about the apostles is that they were teaching an infallible truth. I know the word infallible is not there, but you understand the perspective of these writers of the church fathers. They're looking back at these times and they're looking back at the apostles, and they saw what was taught by them as certain truth. And so there is this truth that's being taught out by them. And then he mentions that he's a trumpet of the Holy Spirit, meaning he's a vessel. I mean, a trumpet doesn't make noise on its own. It takes somebody to blow into the trumpet in order to bring song and melody and all those things out of it. So here's Paul being perceived as somebody who is an instrument for God to bring the message of truth into the world. And he's dealing, obviously, with the apostolic office. He said, now, if Paul, who had those qualities, had to recourse to the great Peter, which we're assuming that this is either referring to Galatians, where Paul in chapter 1 of Galatians talks about how he went back and corresponded with Peter, spent time with him there. Some would say this is going back to Acts 15. I do not. I think later in the letter, and what he says in a minute, actually perceives to me that he seems to be talking about Galatians 1 and 2 that Paul was referring to. And specifically, since he's saying Paul did these things, I think he's actually referring to Paul's own statements in addition to Paul's activities. So he says here, in order to obtain a decision from those in Antioch who are disputing about living by the law. Again, this is why some people think it'd be Acts 15. What, or much more, do we small and humble folk run to the Apostolic See, catch that, to get healing from the sores of the churches? I want to revisit this very carefully. And I'll pull the screen off so that those who are watching, we can focus on this. This is a Eastern father writing to the Pope of Rome. This is the Bishop of Rome, Leo the Great. He's saying if Paul felt it necessary to go to Peter to deal with the issue of circumcision, to get a decision from him, how much more of us? And he's not like a small dude, he's a bishop. He's saying to Leo, if that's what Paul did in order to find resolution, healing for fraction in the church, was to go to Peter, how much more should we little folk over here go to the See of Peter, which he's doing by writing this letter, to find healing from the sores that the churches have been inflicted by? Again, I'm going to highlight it again. To get healing from the sores of the churches. These sores, in the context of the correspondence that's been going on, are fractions, schisms. And he recognizes something about the pattern of even the apostles themselves, which is why I went to Acts 1, is that they are going to Peter for unity and healing. Now, I'm just going to be bold and I'm going to be blunt. And I'm going to say this. If we are going to find healing in the churches across the world, and that the true churches that are of the apostles are to become one as Christ is one, it is impossible for this task to take place without the See of Peter leading the way. Now, some of you are not going to like that, but even Anglicans realize, and even Anglo-Catholics realize, that unity with the Church of Rome, the See of Peter, is the only way that there's actually going to be a functionally holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, to have one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. The East knows this. The East doesn't even, like, the East can fight this if they want. And by the way, the Eastern readers and writers in modern times go to these letters right here and they'll go, well, I mean, these are just niceties. Well, there's certainly a flattering idea into this, but to think that this letter is just simply based on niceties when he's actually using Paul as an example with Peter's relationship on how to have steps to deal with the problems in the church and solutions end in the See of Peter in Rome, to act as if this is just some niceties is absurd. He's clearly demonstrating to all of us that the practice must come from the pattern Paul left for us, that we go to the Western Church of Peter, the See of Peter, to find healing in schism. I've asked this question recently to Anglican friends, Lutheran friends, Presbyterian friends, Eastern friends. Ever since there's been a break of the relationship with the church at Rome, the See of Peter, which is bigger than the Pope, by the way. All of this is bigger than the Pope. What we're finding in this letter here, specifically from Theodoret, it's not about Leo. There's been very, very bad leaders in the bishopric of Rome. There's bad leaders in and now. That's not the question. When we say the See of Peter, that transcends a single man. That transcends one single person, even as indicated in this letter. When we're talking about the Bishop of Rome, we're talking about the papacy. There has been a universal understanding that his voice matters as the authority with all voices in the church. It doesn't mean Peter is better than everybody. It doesn't mean that the Roman church is better than everybody. It doesn't mean that they get it right every time and everybody else gets it wrong. That's not the point for me. But it means that the schismatic nature, as I mentioned a second ago, that I asked all my friends, I've been talking to Lutherans about this, I've been talking to Presbyterians and Anglicans, especially Anglicans, about this. How have we been doing since we've detached ourselves from the communion of Rome. There's been multiple attempts to reunite that. Even the ACNA tried and absolutely failed, and they backed out of negotiations from all accounts and purposes that I've been told. There's been negotiations with the continuing Anglicans in Rome. Lutheran churches are now, especially in Europe, there's one group of Lutherans that is in the actual paperwork process of joining union with Rome, similar to how the Anglican Ordinariate did. But how are the churches doing without that? How are the churches doing without communion? Now, again, I'm not saying that everybody in Rome is all lovey-dovey and getting along and high fives and everything else. I'm not saying that. Hear me carefully. I had somebody say the other day, well, Rome is only unified on paper. They're not unified in practice. Well, that sounds really good. And that sounds like a good Facebook or an Instagram quote. But here's the thing. In order to be unified in practice, you got to be unified on paper first. The problem, especially in the Anglican circles, is that we are not unified amongst ourselves. On this very program, just a few months ago, Stephen Alspich from the Catholic Brothers was on, and he asked the question, he said, have you guys figured out what Anglicanism is in relation to Orthodoxy? Because what is an Orthodox Anglican? Because it doesn't seem like you guys can agree on that. And you know what? He's right. And I think it's time that we all accept that. That is true. We do not. The conservative Anglicans, especially those in the ACNA, say that they're a part of Orthodoxy together, but there's heresy going on in many of these churches. They're not unified. I spent enough time in the ACNA to know they are not unified, especially on the issue of women's orders. And that's not a small matter. That's the issue of validating and bringing an invalid Eucharist and sacrament into the church. They're not unified on even how many sacraments there are. There are 2 or there are 7. They're not unified around these subjects. And I can go on and on. The Lutheran Church is splintered across the board. And again, I'm just taking the conservative side of it. Then you have the liberal side in this, the Episcopals, the Church of England, places in Canada and Australia. Now you're really dysfunctional. I was reading a different side. I didn't realize how many different splinters there were in Anglicanism and Lutheranism and Presbyterianism. It's like, oh my goodness. You view it as conservative and liberal. Now, again, they could all fall into one of those camps. But even the conservative groups are splintered amongst themselves and keep splintering. If we're going to solve the issue of splintering, one of the functions of the Bishop of Rome is to try to maintain peace with all the other apostolic sees. I will give Pope Francis this. There's not a lot I'll give him. Very, very little. This is the one little positive thing I'll say about him. We've done entire shows. I've had Eric Yabar on here criticizing his statements, his decisions. I've been on different programs with Michael and dealing with Pope Francis's comments and him trying to figure out a way to defend him. I've been very critical of Pope Francis. Okay. But I will say this about him, and it's to his fault as well. He is very much trying to bring peace and unity amongst the churches. I just recently read an article, and you should go read it too, where he was meeting with a lot of the Eastern church leaders, the patriarchs, their bishops, and they actually had profitable conversations. I mean, he and really the Bishop of Constantinople are very close. I mean, they seem to pray for each other regularly. They speak highly of each other. Honestly, if it weren't for the Russian Orthodox, there'd be major, probably groundwork for some sort of unification. It's really the Russian Orthodox that are causing problems over there. But that leads you to even the Eastern Orthodox. People say, well, come to Eastern Orthodoxy. It's a true church. I think so. Sure. Yeah. It's the Church of the Church of John and Andrew, Peter's brother. Yeah, we get that. But they're not unified amongst themselves either. The Orthodox are very, very, very much not on the same page right now. What's going to fix this? You see, somebody has to be the leader. Somebody has to replace Judas Iscariot. If you got 11 voices talking at the same time, Judas never got replaced. It seems like that the gospel writers of Matthew and Luke point to us that Peter was given some sort of leader and authority position to continue the ministry of Jesus with the other apostles. Peter's not excluding anybody else in Acts 1. It's like, hey, we are a part of this ministry. We need somebody to join us to complete the fulfillment of all that was going to be. We need our mission to be brought to fulfillment. We need somebody else to do this and replace Judas. But it wasn't 11 guys talking over each other. It seems like everybody in that room, beyond the 12, followed the leadership of Peter in instituting the next steps. It seems to be the pattern that the church continues in later as well. Let's keep reading. For it is fitting that you should be in all things, have the preeminence, seeing that your see possesses many peculiar privileges. Did you see that? It is fitting that the Bishop of Rome should have preeminence. What date is this? Is this post-Vatican I? No. This is pre-Vatican I by quite a few years. We're in the 5th century. Again, Cyrus here, folks, Cyrus, Bishop of Cyrus, this is out in the East, the Eastern Father, writing to the Pope of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, recognizing his leadership and preeminence, that if the church is going to heal, if you're going to find healing from all the splintering, it's going to be through Rome. You can do all the work of uniting the Lutheran groups. You can do all the work of uniting all the Anglican groups just amongst the conservatives alone. And then if you have the liberals, that's impressive too. But you still have not reached one holy Catholic and apostolic church without a unification with the See of Peter. Now, I don't think that means that there should be every I dot and T crossed agreements. I think that there's actually going to always be some level of disagreement. Everybody's going to have to give and take. It's what are you willing to give and take, right? That's going to be the negotiation. But somebody has to be the leader of the See of the churches, the Sees, if you would. And it has always, in the history of the church, functionally come from the See of Peter. And here's recognition of it. Now, the different privileges they talk about here, that's Theodora talks about, is that, well, when you go through the cities, you know, they're all named and given their glories from their beauty and population and all this other stuff. But here he says, Rome, but your city has the fullest abundance of good things from the giver of all that is good. For she is of all cities the greatest and most famous, the mistress of the world, teeming with population. And besides this, she has created an empire which is still predominant, has imposed her name upon her subjects. So these are reasons that don't necessarily apply today, but he's recognizing in that time its prominence beyond just an idea of Peter, you know, that's his see, so, you know, preeminence goes to that. No, there's more reasons, and he's giving reasons. But then he gives a chief reason. But her chief decoration is her faith, to which the divine apostle is a sure witness when he exclaims, your faith is proclaimed in all the world. That's Romans 1:8. And if immediately after receiving the seeds of the saving gospel, she bore such a weight of wondrous fruit that words are sufficient to express the piety of which is found in her, she has too the tombs of our common fathers and teachers of the truth, Peter and Paul, to illuminate the souls of the faithful. Now, catch that phrase there. So they know that Peter and Paul are there in Rome. Their bodies still remain in Rome. And that alone gives it some sort of prominence. Now, you think about that for a minute. Why would the relics of the apostles have any say-so or conclusion in this? What benefit we talking here? I found this part to be extremely intriguing. I don't know about you. It's the presence of Peter and Paul they're dead. The presence of Peter and Paul being dead still shows some form of impact that brings light to people who are seeking to get out of darkness. Like, how does all that work? Let's talk about that for a minute. So the presence of the tombs of Peter and Paul, which, by the way, you can still go visit today, St. Peter's Basilica. Paul is a little bit further, closer to the Tiber. If you go, you can visit the relics of Paul, and then you can go toward closer to the Vatican. You can actually visit in St. Peter's Basilica. You can go right up to it. You can even take a tour down into the very depths and there see and be in the presence of St. Peter's relics. Still there. See, Peter and Paul are not just apostles. They are. But he calls them common fathers, meaning their function in Rome became something relevant to the entire world. Now, the phrase that he uses to illuminate the souls of the faithful that I focused on a second ago, to me, that suggests that their presence is still continuing to bless believers hundreds of years after their death. Remember, we're in the 5th century, folks. This is the 5th century that we're talking about. And they view this as the relics of Peter and Paul doing powerful things in the city of Rome. I asked this question not long ago. I was talking to a friend of mine. I said, the Eastern Church has a lot of relics of the apostles, some of which were just recently given to them. In fact, Pope Francis just gave some of the relics from Peter to the East as a sign of peace. As it relates to these conversations, I cannot ignore again this question that I asked my friend. How is it that the See of Peter has all these major artifacts, relics, and things in their possession, and that they seem to hold a lot of the things that bring the fullness of Christianity in the past and Christianity in the present, all into a united form? So much so that they're letting these things be given out to other churches, including churches that are just regular parishes down the road. I mean, you can go 10 minutes from here at one of the local Catholic parishes here, and they have relics of St. Linus with Roman certification letter for it, who was Peter's next successor, ordained by Peter in Rome. His relics are 10 minutes apart. Parts of his relics are 10 minutes down the road from us here in Greenville. This is the point that, oddly enough, an Eastern Father is making. The faith is what it is most known for, and it has the testimony and the illuminating power still in Rome because the relics of the apostles, Peter and Paul, are in that city. It's a powerful thing when you're reading this. So let's wrap this up. What is the point? What are we getting at? I think in order to find a unified church, a one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, not just that it exists, because I do believe there is one that exists, but functionally exists. It is impossible to do this, even if we were to unite all these other groups within themselves. If they do not unite themselves to the See of Peter, they are not in the actual framework of one holy Catholic Apostolic Church that Jesus was praying for that would be one. It is impossible to have this without Peter. The See of Peter, which is bigger than a pope. It's bigger than one pope. It's bigger than a couple of years. It's bigger than the medieval period. It's bigger than a century. Okay? It's bigger than that. There's bad people everywhere in every church. But Jesus said that he would build it and that the gates of hell would not prevail against it. He said that before Peter ever made his proclamation. It's not hinging on Peter getting it right, because in the very same chapter, Peter got it wrong and had to get rebuked just a few minutes after, which shows us it was never contingent on Peter getting it right every time. In fact, Paul had to rebuke him to the face. It doesn't mean he's without the ability of being rebuked or corrected. There's a lot of corrections that need to happen in Rome. All of us agree with that. I would think every Roman Catholic agrees with that. There's changes that need to be happening quickly in the church. But it doesn't change the setup. And if we believe God is going to build his church and Christ is going to do it as he said he would, somehow, some way, he's going to do it through the See of Peter. And I suggest that we all start first and foremost with our personal decisions of our relationship with the See of Peter. Take your likes, your dislikes, your disgust, all that, put it on the table. Talk about things you can't stand, things that you wish were different or whatever. That's good. You got to get it out. And figure out how much of that really is important enough to continue to stay at arm's length from the church that Christ instituted through Peter and Paul. And ask yourself this question. Are those issues significant enough? Now, many of you may say yes. Then that has to be followed up with another question. And what are you doing about that to repair it? What are you doing about that to repair that? If it's to constantly call it out and make public statements that just constantly put it down, and you have no solutions to actually work towards something, and you just want to share your feelings, well, you're getting nowhere. Nowhere. It's not going to do anything. When's the last time you prayed that the Lord would restore the churches, the holy sees around the world, to be unified? We've come so far in our sectarianism, folks, that I fear that if the East and the West ever got together again, and some of these other holy sees of the apostles were ever to come into unity, we would hear from some of, especially the Protestant churches, a lot of conspiratorial dispensationalism, that the false prophet and the beast have all come together and made a contract. And that may sound funny, and some of you may be even giggling if you're driving down the road and listening to this on your podcast, that's your favorite one to listen to, or you're sitting at your house watching this on YouTube. Some of you may chuckle at that, but you know I'm also right. If the churches came together and found unity, many, many Protestant churches would claim the fulfillment of the book of Revelation is happening in front of our eyes, and that there has been a one world religion that has been created to bring in the Antichrist, and that the Pope would be the false prophet, and all these patriarchs in the East and so forth would be a part of the minions that bring catastrophe to the world. Rather than a celebration, Christ has restored his church. So, was the See of Peter supposed to lead all the other sees? Was it supposed to be the leader of the churches? Yes. The New Testament teaches it. The early church teaches it. Later church fathers from the East were already recognizing it, seeing it that way, and as patterned in the New Testament scriptures. All right, folks, that's all we have time for today. Thanks again for tuning into this episode of Facts. If this is your first time, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. If you're on the podcast, make sure you get that notification for new episodes as they release. And as always, grace and peace to you. God bless.